boundaries and say, how far can this thing go? How much change is possible? What is the limits of a created kind? The one that's particularly thorny for him is this close genetic juxtaposition of humans and chimpanzees. They're very, very close to one another. They're actually closer than what you will find, say, between horses and zebras, which makes it challenging from a young Earth perspective, right? Because if you say horses and zebras are within one group, then it becomes very challenging from a biological perspective to say humans and chimps fall into distinct groups. You see that's the issue at play there. Ironically, young Earthers' answers in Genesis in particular, because they're hypothesizing that all the speciation that we see today is the result of post-flood speciation 6,000 years ago, they actually propose evolution within those limited kinds at an absolutely astronomical rate, much, much faster than any evolutionary biologist now would propose, because standard evolutionary biology says this takes millions of years to do. Whereas they're saying, yep, figure out what was on the ark, and everything we see now is post-flood speciation. So if you go to the Answers in Genesis Creation Museum, you'll actually see diagrams that have just explosive speciation put out there for you to see. And they see that as an integral part of their model. And that used to be controversial within young Earth creationism back in the 50s and 60s, but it no longer is. Good question, though. Thanks. Back to lecture 4. Anything else you want to chat about? Yeah.
I was wondering how the scientific idea of evolution kind of fits into like the idea of how the universe came about. Like not just on Earth.
I'll attempt an answer, and then you let me know if I'm getting close to what you're interested in terms of how I understand it. The question was, sort of, how does evolution as a theory fit into the broader scheme of sort of universal cosmological development over time? Is that kind of what you're yes and no? What you'll actually often see from a young Earth perspective is that all of that sort of Big Bang, stellar formation, solar system formation, cosmology, all that stuff is sort of lumped up and they just call it evolution. They actually sort of collapse it all into one model because all of it requires time over 6,000 years. So often when you're seeing critique of evolution from a young Earth perspective, they're actually kind of lumping that all in together. So they're lumping in physics and cosmology all into that in one group. So they sort of critique the whole thing at a go. Does that get what you're asking, or? I'm happy to try again if it didn't. No. Yeah, so you'll often see just sort of evolution, like Big Bang and evolution kind of just gets all slumped together as one big theory. And as we see when we get to the very end of it and start looking at atheistic, sort of evangelistically atheistic evolution, they actually do propose that as sort of one big unifying thing that goes across science and beyond science into metaphysics, and they see that as a satisfying view of origins without any God involved in the process. So, but that's at the very end when we get there. Yeah.
Where do you stand in all of this?
Where do I stand on this? You'll have to wait till the end. And even then I may not tell you. I'm just trying to lay out the options for you. I don't want you to be influenced by my particular views necessarily before the time. But I've also hinted broadly before that I am a biologist and I am a practicing scientist in this area. So you probably could guess from that that I don't have a fundamental issue with science as a process. I think that there are two forms of knowing that go together quite well, science and faith. So maybe I'll just leave it at that for now. But actually, that's an important point. Arguments from authority in science count for diddly, right? An argument from authority is basically me standing up and saying, I have a PhD in biology and I know better than you, and you should go with my views. Theories in science stand or fall on the weight of evidence and on the weight of their predictive power. So someone who stands up with a PhD in something or other doesn't really speak with authority. What speaks with authority is these theories that are out there that have been contentiously fought over for a long time. as competing ways of making predictions. That's another good point to make. Scientists don't reject young Earth creationism because of philosophical or metaphysical commitments. They reject it simply because it's not a useful paradigm for making predictions. You can't use it to make predictions that are borne out. So just as at a pragmatic level, scientists go with what makes useful predictions. So far, evolutionary theory has had a 150-year run, and we haven't falsified it yet. So we're still going down that avenue. We're going to see how far it'll take us. If we ever hit the end, and we realize that there's some overarching theory that we have not yet put in, then, well, we might get to that end. Physics hit that end, right? Newtonian mechanics was the paradigm of the day until Einstein came along and said, you know what? There's stuff here that we just can't account for under the current model. Now, Newtonian mechanics technically is wrong at this level, at sort of quantum levels of organization. But relativity in Einstein's work, well, the stuff Newton was working on is still valid. We just recognize that it's restricted to a certain range of observation, whereas Einstein's work didn't invalidate Newton, but it expanded it. So we might end up hitting that with evolution at some point. But so far we've had a 150-year run with it, and so far it still seems to be generating testable and supportable predictions. So scientists or pragmatists are just going to keep running with it until it hits a wall.
How do the young Earth people, what do they have to say about DNA and how it supports the evolutionary theory?
The question is, what do young Earthers have to say about DNA and whether or not it supports their model or evolutionary theory? It's regrettable that most of the information you get on the popular websites is misleading. It's selective, and it typically misrepresents what real scientists actually know about the field. So that's like me sitting in that seminar kind of going, come on, that's such a misrepresentation. And what about this? And what about that? And boy, you're really spinning this for a certain perspective. And you have a PhD in genetics. You really ought to know better. And part of me thinks, yeah, you really do know better, but you're not being forthright with your audience. Then I find people like Dr. Wise, who's a trained paleontologist who honestly wants to struggle with the issues and deal with the data as the science has borne out. Or I find Dr. Wood, who really is a molecular biologist and wants to approach these issues and basically saying, look, here's the data. If we're going to advance the model, we have to deal with the data honestly. So there's this disconnect between the popular level and the academic level. And I would really like to see that change, even for the movement as a whole, for the health of its own movement. It needs to, if it's going to move the model forward, it's going to have to be honest about the data. And so far, it seems to be more of a don't ask, don't tell approach. People at the church level don't want to hear it. You might think, well, why have I never heard a sermon on this on Sunday? Well, it's not exactly great preaching material, right? It doesn't fit nicely and easily, perhaps, with what a large number of people in church want to hear. So, just like if you think back 400 years ago, with heliocentrism and the competition with Galileo, or the controversy with Galileo, the church wasn't concerned about the science. They were concerned about the implications for theological interpretation of certain portions of Scripture. And it happened at a time where there was political instability, and the Catholic Church basically said, no, we're going to put a stop to this. Ironically, the Catholic Church seems to have learned its lesson on that front, and they basically figured one Galileo was enough. Right? So you can find Pope John Paul and whatnot saying, well, evolution is more than a hypothesis, there's converging lines of evidence for it, and Catholics typically don't have a huge issue with this. But Protestants certainly do.
I guess for me, like I grew up with young creation.
Yep.
And I think more than the science that they were, the folk science was being thrown back and forth. It was the whole mentality of warfare.
Yeah,
that really
it's a
turned me
culture.
off of it.
Yeah.
And so I'm not sure where I'm not going into science, sorry. But I'm not sure where I
But
stand
were
on
you
it.
turned off it at a young age because of that? That would be my concern and question. And I hope not, but maybe you were.
Yeah, no, not, and I guess just like the warfare that goes between the two sides. Like in the videos, in the Glover videos,
Right.
just lobbying at philosophical materialism versus, God, and then doing folk science versus